Maliek Blade.
This week's guest is
regular contributor to the Black Berea podcast, Israel Kolade. How are you doing today, sir?
I'm doing well, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
I'm glad to have you on. If you haven't heard already, there's an accent there. And Israel is representing from London currently. And I thought it'd be great to have him on to speak to life and culture and coming to faith in London. I think that's a unique experience for African Americans here in the States because there's a lot that we don't know about international cultures of Black people. We typically understand the African American culture, and it's harder to reach beyond that and even understand African culture because I think it's important to highlight that even as African Americans, we don't necessarily identify with Native Africans. So there's some cultural differences that exist that are often assumed to be the same just because we look the same. So just for beginners, could you walk us through where you were born, life and development as far as location? I know you weren't necessarily born in London, but you spent most of your formative years there.
Yeah. So I was born in Nigeria, more specifically in Ibadan, Nigeria, which is sort of like a university city in Nigeria. And I moved to London when I was 6. I've been here ever since. I haven't actually been back to visit Nigeria since arriving when I was 6. And so I've spent, like you said, pretty much all my lived experience and my memories of life have been in London. I have about 3 or 4 memories of life in Nigeria. And so although I was born in Nigeria, I think in a very real sense, I classify my experience more specifically as Black British as compared to, for example, someone who spent all their life in Nigeria and moved to London when they were 25 or 26.
Yeah. Okay. So what sparked the move from Nigeria?
Well, so initially my mom was actually born in London. Her grandparents, or my grandparents, her parents, moved to London post-World War II as part of the call from the British government to Commonwealth countries to come and help rebuild England post-World War II. So they moved here initially because it was an opportunity to work, to increase their assets and hopefully return and to be able to give back to the community in Nigeria. So they moved there. They moved here. My mom was born here, and then she moved back to Nigeria when she was about 6. And so I was born there, and by the time I was 6, my parents moved back to London due to, again, a new wave of opportunities in England. At that time, they had started to make universities pay students, essentially. So there was whole nursing departments that would pay people to study nursing so they could increase the workforce in certain industries. So it was a very opportune time to move to England. And so my parents moved here for those opportunities, and I've been here ever since.
Got it. So in terms of diversity being in London, I know here oftentimes there's the United States, and then there's different different states within the country, and we're moving toward, I guess they say in the next 30 years or so, maybe more, toward being a majority minority country. But as it stands today, there is still a majority of Caucasian people as far as the majority group and here. Now, when you go to certain states, like originally I'm from Southeast Washington, D.C., and that area was more predominantly Black. But then right down the street, you'll find more white areas. So there's this common idea of still being the minority here and there being spaces that are more so Black spaces, more so white spaces, and some that are diverse. And then all the other racial groups as well. So those are our dynamics here. I think, and this could show my ignorance, but my assumption would be, I imagine that there's a very stark I would guess that in your case, the numbers are pretty overwhelming in terms of representation of Black people and white people. Is it more overwhelmingly white, or am I kind of projecting something that might not be the case necessarily in London? Or how does that break down as far as racial dynamics?
Well, yeah, London, I think in the United Kingdom is a very unique situation. It's extremely diverse, uh, and so I know, just starting from personal experience, in one borough alone, so we have about 33 boroughs. In my borough where I grew up, Greenwich, you had at least, I think, over 100 different languages being spoken in some respect, whether in small groups or in larger communities in that borough. So it's extremely diverse. But I think London is a unique situation to the wider country, because the country as a whole is still, I think, vastly rural, and so it's majority white. I think the country, yes, is probably about 80 to 90% white, but it's a very different situation when you come to London, where roughly speaking, it's 50-50 right now, I think, just on the edge of becoming majority minority, um, like you've stated for some cities in the US.
So, do you feel any of the, well, I'll give you context. So, for here, it may not be as overt at times, but there's somewhat of a divide and a tension. While
Mm.
there are, you know, interracial marriages and people interacting very well in some cases, there's a more, sometimes more obvious and sometimes more covert division that exists, and tension that exists between the races. Do you feel that there at all?
Uh, yes, and it varies in degrees. I'll start by saying I think the historic like white minority racial difference is there. It's a lot more covert, I would say, than the US. Mainly because British people tend to be a lot more polite. There's a part of British culture is a certain degree of politeness, and so um, you don't typically find overt forms of racism, but you do find it in covert forms. In certain communities, it's a lot more visible, but I would probably say that they are fringe areas. So I know where I live right now in Greenwich Borough, if you just drive about 15 minutes going out of London, southeast, you would enter areas that I think are a lot more racially charged, which would be a lot more uh, disturbing for minority communities in their experience there. There's also, because London is so diverse, there's also racial tensions between minority groups, and so I know. So I went to, just before you go to university, we do something called sixth form, which is like 2 years before going to university, where you study extra qualifications to go to university. And when I went to a school in East London that is a majority minority, um, but specifically there was a lot of racial tension between blacks and Asians,
Hmm.
West African in particular, and Pakistani, Bangladeshi minority communities, and those two, at least when I was there, I don't know how much has changed now. When I was there, those two communities had very real tensions. I think specifically just because they were both trying to navigate a very hostile and strange land. You had massive influx of people coming from their respective countries, and so there's safety, obviously, in staying within your ethnic group so that you can navigate this new experience together. But being in the same context geographically as another minority community and having clashes of culture brought tensions about there. And that differs from area to area. So, one part of London, so for example, East London, can have huge amounts of one particular community, and you go to another part of London, it changes quickly and quite radically. And so from area to area, you have different racial tensions that people can experience.
Sure. And in terms of, I imagine your people there are aware of the states. To get
Mm.
kind of a inside look, how are you guys perceiving our racial dynamics here? Or how are we viewed, the states, and viewed in terms of that?
Uh,
And I know I'm asking you a big question to speak for. Don't feel like you have to speak for the whole country, obviously, but
mm,
just your experience, what you've observed.
yeah, I I think broadly speaking, and yeah, like you said, it isn't a statement for every single person in London, but there is, I think, a general perception that race relations in the US is quite unbelievable in the way that it's going, and honestly, for a lot of us, it seems ridiculous that certain things are still being treated as radical, or areas that shouldn't be touched. So, for example, um, in London, being so diverse, there's been a lot of work by the Greater London Assembly. That's the governing institution for the city, the Mayor of London, and so on, to really foster um, relations between different ethnic groups, different minority groups, and the larger community, and just starting initiatives and programs that really try to build a new cohesion between previously estranged groups. But for us, when we look at the US, we don't see that kind of drive, or to the same degree as we see in London. And a lot of us can just sort of scratch our heads and wonder, why isn't that the case? Given, I think, specifically the history of race in the US, that there would be a far greater push to really form deep bonds between different groups, and to actually celebrate the various cultures and the various communities, while also seeking to have greater cohesion between them. So that's one example, I think, of a way in which a lot of us in London can just look at the US situation and wonder, why is it still like this, or why don't we see as much of a push? Another thing I think we see is social media being as big as it is now, and being mainly dominated by the US, means that for a lot of us in Europe and in London, we are exposed to so much of what happens in the US. And media being media, it tends to be what's negative, because I think, generally speaking, negative press is what gets the clicks and so on.
Yeah.
And so we see so much issues occurring in the US, and we then wonder, so if all of this is happening, why isn't there a push to really seek tangible, concrete solutions? So I know, for me, as a Black Briton, and for a lot of other people, a lot of other Black British people in the UK, we see, recently, over the last 6 to 10 years, all the police brutality that's been occurring, and there's a serious question as to why isn't there more push, specifically from the government, or from local authorities, to actually tackle those issues with a very serious tone and aggression, that we, I think, can see in the UK, although the UK still has its problems in terms of police brutality or even government effectiveness. We still have those questions around the current state of the US and its civic society.
Yeah. Well, I really, with you raising that, I almost, I had to catch myself, because I really want to to speak to, well, this is what's going on here, and this is why, and this is how our government functions, and these are the problems, these are the blind spots. But I don't want to get too far off from understanding your story, so maybe we can come back to it. But
Mm-hmm.
I think it'd be helpful to understand, all right, your process in terms of coming to faith. So it might have been a situation where you were always in or around church. So obviously coming to Christ was
Mm-hmm.
an easy transition. That might be the case, or there might be more to it than that. So could you speak to, first, before you speak about church life or church culture, just speak to your individual experience of at what moment or what process took place that led to you coming to faith in Christ?
Mm. It's a good question. It's actually quite an interesting story. So, like you said, I grew up in a African Pentecostal church. My parents were Christians, are Christians. My dad was a deacon, my mom was a Sunday school teacher. And so growing up in church, I was told the Bible stories, I was singing the hymns, and going through, I think, the standard cycle of the Christian experience and church community and so on. So I think for most of my childhood, I sort of assumed I was a Christian, because while I go to a church, I have family who are Christians, and this is what I know, and so therefore I'm a Christian. And out of that, I was very involved, especially because my parents were involved. And in my youth group, I started Christian rap, especially as a response to sort of the initial rise of Reach Records. So the Lecrae, Tripley, the Jesus music sort of tracks, that era. Out of that, I desired so much to do Christian rap. And so while I was doing that, I also actually started got into a relationship with a girl, and we were doing things that were very hypocritical and contrary to the things I was preaching, so to say, in my rap songs and so on. Around the age of 16, in the summer, one of my friends, he wasn't a Christian, he was also a rapper, but wasn't a Christian at school, said, Christians should probably be the best rappers because they have the whole Bible to work with. Look at how much material you have to work with. Why don't you guys make better songs? And so I was like, yeah, I want to, meet that challenge. So I picked up the Book of Romans, and I was like, I'm going to make a whole album of tracks in the Book of Romans. So I start reading it, doing my initial research, and I get to Romans 5, and I read that line, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly while we're yet sinners. Christ died for the ungodly. And I just kept thinking, especially knowing the hypocritical life I was living, that could it really be true that Jesus Christ loves me right now in my sin and in my lack of interest for him, specifically in my personal relationship with him, that he still loves me right now before I, fully commit and so on. And being moved by that, I really felt pressed to to make a decision and to say, if it is true, if what Romans 5 is telling me is true, then I the only appropriate response from me is to love him back fully and wholeheartedly, with the same fervor and the same commitment that he has showed me and continues to show me. And so at that point, I think I personally said I will identify with Christ, that I will accept what he has done for me, and in response give my life to him. And from there, I feel like I started the Christian journey all over again. I find myself having to read the Bible from scratch and actually understand for myself what these beliefs were that I'd been taught growing up for so long, and actually claim them as mine and personally choose to identify with them, as opposed to just make it something that I hold to as a social experience, as part of a bigger community.
Sure. So in terms of church life, you mentioned African Pentecostal.
Yeah.
Is that where that's where they went, but what was your first church culture or church experience?
Well, so after becoming a Christian, I stayed at my church. I was the drummer for my church, and so I was still very much involved. But I started to have some tensions with, I think, the Pentecostal experience, specifically in relation to like the prosperity gospel, and the health and wealth message, the claim it, name and claim it prosperity message. And at that time, one of my friends, he went to the same sixth form as me, just before university, introduced me to sort of like the new Calvinist movement, to Mark Driscoll, John Piper, Bodie Barker, and Paul Washer, and all these other names. And through online sermons, I think I started to move towards a fuller understanding of Christianity that didn't have this tendency to reduce it to what you can get in the here and now, but wanted to discover the details of the Bible, the details of the historic Christian faith, and so on. And out of that, I moved eventually, leaving my parents' church, and went to a Reformed Baptist church. It was a very, very different experience.
Right.
You know, my church growing up, we would have services that were 5 hours long, and I switched from that to a church that had organ, used a hymn book, sang very, Charles Wesley traditional songs, and that church context was very different. It was also, interestingly enough, all black church, which I still think to this date, to my knowledge anyway, it's the only fully black reformed church in London. And so that, I think, was a relief for me in terms of seeing black Christians who wanted to take the Bible seriously, but it was also a challenge for me because it was a very different church culture to the one that I knew growing up. And it took a lot of adapting and wrestling to really sit well with it and still appreciate, I think, the African style and the African tradition of Christianity that I experienced growing up.
So that's really interesting because I was tracking with you, and your story, although you're all the way over there, is so similar to a lot of people's experience here. Up until the point where you said you ended up going to a black Reformed Baptist church. So I didn't think much about these denominational and theological camps in terms of when I came to faith. I was more so in mostly non-denominational churches, maybe ministering in black churches that leaned more charismatic or Pentecostal. And then when I began college, I went to basically a seminary that had a college. It was a Southern Baptist seminary, basically leans more toward Reformed theology. And, it was pretty much all white for the most part. And after I started there, from the first year of my bachelor's degree to the final year of my master's degree, the school did begin to diversify more. But something I noticed is a lot of black men and women had a similar experience to you, where they were growing up in churches that were maybe Pentecostal or more charismatic. And I don't necessarily, I'm not meaning to come against that in any way. So that's the experience. But then I don't think this is the case. I'm trying to be very careful. I don't think this is the case for all, but there is a commonality, like you mentioned, to also in that space, it to come with some doctrine I think is questionable, but also somewhat of a prosperity gospel approach, the name it, claim it, the idea that God is that God can be coerced to a certain extent. If we do a certain thing, then God is obligated to respond a certain way. So, that was a lot of people's experience. And then, just like you said, somehow a friend or a book or a sermon, you get introduced to these Reformed preachers. And, and some of that happened with me. But in my unique experience, I got to seminary and was encouraged by the additional things I saw, but I also saw some flaws in it. So while I can look at some of the more charismatic black church experience and see some good and some bad, I didn't get exposed to the Reform guys and think that they were the trough of knowledge. I saw great things, but I also saw some things that I think were worth criticism as well. So I wasn't as impressed to the point where I immersed myself in it. I say that because a common thing I experienced in seminary was you would have specifically black men who were raised in a more charismatic black church context. They get to seminary, and after they get there, they begin to shed all aspects of black culture and the church history that they had in exchange for this better, more Caucasian approach to worship and church culture and so on and so forth. Because in most cases, when it happens here, they're they're leaving black churches for reformed white churches.
Mhm.
So that's why it's unique that your experience was reformed black church. But here
Yeah.
we end up going to reformed white schools and churches, and unintentional, I think, impact of that becomes a hyper criticism of all things that are black led or that are not reformed and white. Even so much so down to the point where I think dating preferences become very
Mhm.
different. So guys who were at one point open maybe to dating black women begin
Mhm.
to have a new paradigm for what a godly woman is, and they end up in marrying white women. And that's not necessarily wrong, but I think
Right.
it becomes a problem when you are perceiving a certain cultural expression to be more godly or right than another. So
Mm.
in my experience, I expect black guys in reform spaces, if they're married, to be in interracial marriages. I just expect that because it's so common here. Uh, have you seen any aspects of that at all? Does that sound completely crazy? Is that familiar? What do you think?
Uh, I mean, so recently I've been hearing more about that, but I think initially when I joined that Reformed church, looking back, there was a very real sense of the church itself was a shock absorber for Reformed culture.
Hmm.
So so I was there for, I've now moved, and this will be another part of the story. I've moved to a Presbyterian church, but I was
Okay.
there in that Reformed Baptist church for about 4 years. And the first 2 years when I was there learning, I think, Reformed theology and so on, I was doing that in a black context. So we would still listen to, I don't know, the sermon by Kevin DeYoung or whoever on Jesus Christ as God and so on. But we had these discussions in a black context. And so Reformed culture inherently wasn't in the church. So although we were having our critiques and challenges of the Pentecostal tradition, because we all shared that same experience growing up, there
Yeah.
was still a graciousness that came out in our conversations where we
Right.
didn't feel a
Right.
need to abandon our blackness in order to become reformed, because we could clearly see, oh, the person sitting next to me is black and reformed, and they're still through this issue as I am wrestling with it. And we all had questions, and so there was a lot of grace to everyone because everyone's wrestling, everyone's in the same space right now, and trying to figure this thing out. And we all want to take the Bible seriously. We all want to get these answers to our questions. And so I don't think at any point, I didn't feel, and I think a lot of people at church would agree, we didn't feel any need to abandon our blackness in any tangible sense by becoming reformed. It was only, I think, later on that I started to see that for other people, other black British people who had went to a reformed church that was majority white, or an African American, like you said, who would go to a reformed church that was majority white in the US, and the cultural differences then made it harder for them to distinguish the theology from the culture. And so there was an implicit assumption that to adopt the theology is to adopt the culture as well, because you can't actually see clearly the distinction between the two when you're on the inside anyway. And
Yes.
so I look at that now and I think actually I'm glad that I um, wrestled through the Reformed theology in that black context, because it was actually really helpful in avoiding a lot of dangerous assumptions, some of which you stated that I could have easily have adopted as well by being in another context.
Definitely. And yeah,
Mm.
I think a big part of that was, I would say for me, the anchoring was just the culture of being from Washington, D.C. And then when I was
Mm.
exposed to more reform culture, not necessarily theology, because I think the theology can't be perceived as belonging to one culture. But
Right. Yeah.
when I was exposed to reform culture, it was in the South, which is a different culture than further north in Washington, D.C.
Mm.
And I'm trying to bring you into to life here, but people here probably be a bit offended by this. But I'm just going to say it this way to make the point to you, is that a reality that exists here is that we had a war between the North and the South, and the South wanted to continue to own slaves. So the reality is today, although racism is all across America, Southern states are perceived as more racist. So I moved from further north to the South and was exposed to Reformed culture. But while I was at the Reformed white seminary, I was still attending a black church that leaned more Reformed. So in the same way, I think I still had that anchoring of not getting uh, brainwashed or becoming kind of anti-black. Uh,
Right.
Something I'd like to add to this discussion is the cultural piece as well. So you mentioned, and it's funny how all this connects, but you mentioned Bodie Bacham earlier,
Yeah.
who is a prominent black preacher who is more prominent in reform circles than I would say traditional black church circles.
Yeah.
Uh, and I was never really familiar with him. Uh, I heard about him at seminary, and his name came up because uh, people were concerned about certain comments he made about homeschooling, and then and then something happened in the news. So, and we can get to this. We'll close out with this, but you're planning to move here to the States toward the end of July,
Yes.
and you're planning to go to Missouri, correct?
Yes. St. Louis.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So Missouri, I'm not sure if it's the same city, but Missouri was in the news, specifically Ferguson, Missouri, was in
Yeah.
the news a few years back because of the Mike Brown case.
Hmm.
So Mike Brown is an African American male, was with his friend Dorian Johnson, and the story became national news because he was shot several times by an officer, and the details surrounding why that happened were a bit skewed, and everyone had different views. Uh, and once again, you mentioned the police brutality, and the concern was it necessary to shoot him as many times as the officer did, and also uh, he was unarmed, and many people brought into the fact that he potentially stole something from a store as justification for his murder in the streets.
Hmm.
And not to get into the details of whether he was guilty or not, but obviously, uh, I think it's valid for people to be concerned when an unarmed person is shot multiple times by an officer. Uh,
Yeah.
so when that happened, Vody spoke to it in I believe, an article for the Gospel Coalition, and one of his quotes was that Mike Brown reaped what he sowed.
Hmm.
And, I know those comments rubbed me the wrong way. And
Yeah.
my experience is that it's interesting how when black people are immersed in reformed white culture, they tend to adopt views of someone from the cultural distance. So his view and his response to that coincidentally was similar to what many more reformed white men viewed it as. Because, and I'm not trying to make a blanket statement here, but what's common also amongst reformed culture here is it's typically heavy white male leadership, heavy patriotism, support for the country, heavy support for the Republican Party in terms of politics, very much so pro-choice. I'm sorry, pro-life in terms of the abortion issue, and there's certain cultural norms that come with that as well that aren't necessarily biblical demands. Uh, so it seems concerning that although we can support a certain theological framework, that sometimes
Yeah.
it comes as a package deal with certain
Hmm.
cultural perspectives that may be
Hmm.
damaging to certain groups of people.
Yeah. No, I certainly agree. I remember Jamal Tisby. I think this was either a tweet or a comment on the Pastor Mike podcast. He mentioned in talking about sort of conservative reformed culture, that if the only politicians that reformed people invite to their conferences to speak or give platforms to are Republicans, then it inherently gives the image that to be reformed or to be a Christian is to be synonymous with being Republican.
Right.
And that if they are going to invite politicians, they should be inviting Republicans and Democrats alike who are Christians to speak or to share their living out of faith in the work and so on. And so I've definitely seen through social media that sort of assumption that especially if you're black, that if you enter the reformed space, you have to take everything that the culture gives you, its politics, its social understanding and views on justice and race relations and the rest. I think in England, it's slightly different in a number of ways. So I would start by saying the race relations and the police brutality topic is also in the UK to a lesser degree, but still very much as painful to the black community. And so, for example, there was the now famous shooting of Mark Duggan in North London by police in 2011 that led to what is now called the London riots, where there was riots all over London in different districts out of protest and anger, similar to the Ferguson situation, where what actually happened was that incident sort of was the final break for the community, that there's been a lot of history and tension between the black community and the police, and this event happens, which sort of like triggers an emotional eruption. It doesn't justify the riots, it doesn't justify looting or the rest, but it actually says that there's been a lot of pain in this community for so long and they finally can't take enough. And so for us, when that happened, because it was a lot closer to home, there was a receptivity in London across churches, reformed, non-reformed, Pentecostal, Anglican, so on, in terms of actually seeking healing. And that was across political lines, which leads me to my second point, which I think in the UK, there isn't a direct connection between politics and faith in any meaningful sense. So you can't go to any church across all denominations. I think I would comfortably say where you can tell which party they would vote for. The Reformed Baptist Church that I went to, whenever there was a general election, you had people who were going to vote for the Conservative Party, people who were going to go vote for the Labour Party, which is the Liberals, or like the Democrats of England. And they would have the debates after church and then go home and then go out to eat together and have laughs and fun. And so there was very much this assumption that being a Christian doesn't require you to be conservative or liberal, but actually you can come to your own decisions about that as you work out understanding of politics. So for us, when we heard about Vodi Barkham, when we were listening to him, we quickly realized he's very conservative, but we also didn't think that was problematic, because the assumption was that you can be anywhere on the political spectrum as a Christian,
right,
and still be a faithful Christian. The now famous Tim Farron, he was the leader of the Liberal Democrats, which historically has been a very liberal party, was also an evangelical Christian. And when he was in the middle of the general election race, the press really stuck it to him in terms of his Christian beliefs and asked him questions about gay marriage and so on. And he stepped down as the leader in light of all the heat, because the party didn't want that sort of attention. But in all of that, what I think people were seeing was that you can be a Christian, you can be an evangelical Christian and be the leader of a liberal party. And likewise, Theresa May now, being a member of the Church of England, you can also be a Christian and be the leader of the Conservative Party. It can go either way very easily, and no one would think otherwise. which I think is especially as I move to, as I'm planning to move to the US in the coming month, I think it's a very necessary challenge to the US Christian community to really rethink its relationship to politics, to understand that across the world, throughout history, Christians have been all over the political spectrum and have been just as faithful in every area. And so these questions still need to be answered. The issues in terms of race relations in the US still need to be wrestled with and taken very seriously. Ferguson and so on, they need to be addressed. But there shouldn't be, in all of it, there shouldn't be an assumption that to be a Christian is to take one specific side necessarily. Because actually what that does is that it adds more to the gospel and more to the Christian faith than what Jesus Christ has put there for us.
Right. And I would agree that I don't think that Christianity requires allegiance to a certain one or the other. I think that notion is silly, especially considering that we're just in America, we're given basically two parties to pick from. And that's such when you consider how many people live here and how all encompassing the government is in terms of national security, international relations, and so on and so forth. So the idea of limiting it to that, I think, is silly. But something I'll just say to you, as far as coming here, what you'll likely see more and more is a very pervasive culture of many of the leaders in more evangelical reform spaces may not say it explicitly, but there's an understanding that, yes, as a Christian, when you engage politically, you're going to vote Republican, just standard. And here, the basis for that, for many, is that a Christian, a faithful Christian, and once again, people don't say it explicitly, but it's just the culture, is that a faithful Christian wouldn't vote for a Democrat because said Democrat is likely going to be pro-choice in terms of abortion. So you can't really be faithful or in good standing or doing the right thing and support someone who is willing to support the furtherance or the maintenance of the legality of abortion. So I think that idea and some other things are used to kind of pigeonhole people into being given the only option of a faithful Christian votes Republican here, because that's what God would want in order to protect the innocent lives. I don't agree with that, but that definitely is a very pervasive part of our culture. So as you begin to stretch out here, you'll probably see that with reform culture comes that understanding. Once again, it's not going to be said explicitly, but there may be people that are a bit uncomfortable if you're in a reform space, and obviously you wouldn't be voting, but if you're expressing thoughts of support for a pro-choice or Democratic candidate, it might make the room a little tense. So I do think we should have that freedom. The proper balance is, I think, individuals working that out as an individual. But we definitely don't have that balance here. I mean, that it is the case for some. I believe I have it personally, but I don't think that is typical of the broader culture to realize that you can just choose. In reform spaces, there is a heavy leaning and wedding to the Republican Party.
That's really interesting. The issue of single issue voting, and I think I will have to be really mindful of it during my time in the US, because I know in the UK it's not even a possibility in any real terms. We although we have lots of parties, there are still only two dominant parties, and historically it's always gone back between one or the other. I think for the past 45 years, both support advocate abortion, and both advocate same-sex marriage, and so the idea of single issue voting is not even a possibility in the UK. So growing up was very much, well, this is the political scene, irrespective of where you are on the political spectrum, and to support either party is necessarily to support that. So then that quickly became less of a question when it came to political decision making, because either way, that's going to maintain itself as part of the political reality. I kind of have the question of those who really do, and I think you might have a response for this. I think for those who really push that narrative, I wonder what they would do if the Republicans then became pro-choice in the same way that the Democrats are pro-choice. How that would change, or would it change? Do you think it would change their decision making?
Yes. So I mean, each individual, I think, has their personal convictions. But I think realistically speaking, in terms of the governing authorities in our country, when it comes to the Democrats and the Republicans, people want to win. People want power and they want to win.
Right.
And I don't think that many, I mean, obviously some, but I think many pro-life Republicans in government, they may be personally pro-life and it's a moral issue for them. But I also think part of it is pandering to a certain base. So they recognize that this has gotten the attention of a big part of their base, which is evangelical Christian men. So they parrot those ideas because they know it will help them get to victory. So I think it's one of those things where you sell whatever is profitable. So if the culture changed to a point where their concentric was in favor of abortion, I think many of them would flip flop on the issue because it's really about winning. It's not about personal morals. So I think that's the case on the Republican side. And in the same way, I know many Christians who are Democratic who personally don't think that same-sex marriage is right, but because they're active in Democratic politics, they parrot whatever the talking points are of the day. So they say things like, we need to embrace trans rights and same-sex marriage and make all these different kinds of bathrooms to accommodate gender identities. So I think people have their personal views, but when they're attached to a certain organization or party, they say what needs to be said. It's just like when you go to work. If you're having a bad day, you're still going to smile because you're at work. So you're going to put on the face that's necessary for success.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Politically, I think that's very very similar here. Although it doesn't tie in specifically to the Christian community, so I don't know. I need to research this and actually check, but I don't know that the UK political system would actually view evangelical Christians as a legitimate political group that they can cater to.
Yeah.
I don't.
Yeah, it's really big here. Yep.
Yeah. So I don't think that's as the same in the UK. Ethnic groups, I think, definitely yes, and so on. But because Christians are just so spread out politically, it doesn't really work in that same way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's interesting here, that is an understood, as far as the right side, the conservative Republican side, that is an important group for them in terms of wanting to win. They definitely want to align themselves with that group and they expect to win that group. So even most recently with our election in 2016, I can't tell you how much I was overwhelmed with the numbers. I think it was either 86 or 88% of white evangelical men, supported President Trump. So, or Christians and white evangelical Christians in general, it was just made evidently clear that these are the numbers. They voted for him in droves. So, yeah, that's a core group of voters that they wouldn't dare overlook or forget or consider.
Right.
So yeah, that's just the dynamic here. And it's not to say that there's not a large voting base of Christians on the other side, but in terms of the conservative side of things, that exists. So yeah, you're stepping into a lot of, just to say, like we got a lot of mess over here that you're stepping into. But once again, we've talked about some negative aspects, but there also is a lot of positive too. And I will say, just to be clear, so no one's feelings are hurt, there are several brothers and sisters that are black and white in reform circles that I love. who I think represent a realistic balance on these issues. So they're not all single issue voters. They're not all Trump supporters. They're not all racist. They're not all bigots. Although those things here are perceived as common amongst conservative Republicans, that I have seen time and time again with certain relationships that's not the case. So not to make blanket statements is very important to me. So I think we've had a good touch on quite a few different things.
Yeah.
For those that are before we close out, could you take a moment to share more about the purpose and your contribution toward the Black Berea podcast?
Oh yes. So Black Berea is an organization based in London, consisting of 7 members that really try to tackle Bible theology, culture, life through a Christian worldview, and specifically looking at how to engage, affirm, really support the Black community in England broadly and in London in particular. And so my role in the organization is as a regular contributor on the podcast. So I appear frequently, almost every episode, although there are some I'm not there on, and to really engage with the topics of the day. And it's ranged from the music scene in Britain through to politics, discussing different theological issues. We recently had actually, the 15th of June, we had our second live show, which was titled The Gospel for Black Millennials. And so it was looking specifically at Christianity for a new coming generation, the Black British millennials, and what it looks like to engage faithfully and bear Christian witness to the Black British millennial group in London as they move through new seasons of life and through sort of like social change in the community and outside the community as well. So I was on both panels for that show, and both panels actually were recorded and will be on the Black Berea podcast for anyone to listen to if you want to. I also write for the website www.blackberea.com, and we have articles from other people, members of the organization and guest writers. And so I really involved in looking at the culture, looking at life, and thinking about ways we can bring the Christian faith to bear on the city, on the Black community, on culture and society in general, and just keep that message and mission of the Christian faith as being comprehensive for all of life.
Yeah. So I'll add this, and I think your fiance will appreciate this. That I'll just let the sisters know that he's already engaged. You might have some American sisters out here, and they're listening. They like the accent, but just so you know, he's already engaged. And congratulations on that.
Thank you so much. Yes.
If people do want to connect with you on social media, what are your handles?
You can find me on Twitter at IA Kolade, Kolade. So that's IAKOLADE 27. That's my Twitter handle, and also my Instagram handle, IAKOLADE 27. You can find me on Facebook, Israel A. Kolade as well. And I have a personal website, which is cruciform.me. So that's CRUCIFORM.me. And on that website, I have some of my articles, my sermons and talks that I've given. I have also the Covenant campaign, as I'm currently raising funds for my move to St. Louis this summer to start seminary at Covenant Seminary. You can find more things from me there, and I regularly update it. So if you want to keep up to date with what I'm doing or what's currently happening in my life, you can go on the website and subscribe to my mailing list, and you will get regular feeds of new things that are going on, new articles or blog posts that I write, and sermons that I upload, and so on.
Thank you for your time, sir. I appreciate it.
No problem. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
This is Maliek Blade, and that was Guest 2.